Welcome to the Finding the Magic podcast, where books come alive. I'm Tricia Copeland, a fiction author and host of this show. If you love books, finding great reads, and hearing about the story behind the story directly from the authors, this is the place for you. Whether you like fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or romance titles, I think you'll find something to love in my playlist. Listen in to discover something magical about a book or two today. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
I'm super excited to have you here today. We have Jennifer L. Armentrout. She is a YA fantasy author. Do you cover other genres too, or am I only seeing that one?
Well, I write in pretty much all the main age genres, young adult, new adult, and adult. My fantasy stuff is considered new adult or adult, or
Okay.
my newest fantasy stuff. And then my paranormal usually are young adult. And then contemporary, I kind of bounce back and forth between like the age. But I mean, it's so hard now, I think, to specify, reading ages because there's so much crossover.
There is. And, I mean, the rules that I knew from the beginning was call it the age of your character, but it might be a clean new
Mhm.
adult or it might be a PG-13 adult book, right? So
Yeah.
we have all those elements. And I guess I best know you for your fantasy, and I didn't realize you wrote romance. So that's a fun. Maybe I'll ask you a little bit about that too. But your new release is coming out, and next week, A Born of Blood and Ash, which is the finale to the Flesh and Fire series, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so jump us into that one. I read a little bit, but obviously no spoilers. Set up the characters, the world, and how did you create this? It's so amazing.
So the Flesh and Fire series is actually a prequel to the Blood and Ash series. And so that is the main series, Blood and Ash. And even though both of these series can be read without reading the other one, like if you started off reading Blood and Ash and then you read Flesh and Fire, you're probably going to get a lot more of the backstory, and certain things will be answered for you kind of ahead of time than waiting for the next book to come out in the Blood and Ash. But how I came up with it is I was writing like I think it was either the second or third book in the Blood and Ash world, where I knew that certain things were going to start being revealed, like the truth behind like their version of religion, their gods that they worshipped, for example. And as I was preparing to tell that portion of it, I kind of realized that, oh my gosh, if I just do the info dump of it kind of loses like it's not exciting, right? Like when something's info dumped to you. And there was definitely in the Flesh and Fire series, there's a lot of sacrifices that have to happen, um, for the world of Blood and Ash to be what it is. And I wanted to capture that. And that's when I decided to tell the story. Because in the Blood and Ash series, like a lot of what people are raised to believe is not true. And even down to the part of the gods and what they kind of represent. And so it got really important to me to show that story and to show the readers how we got to this point. And so while the Born of Blood and Ash is the final book in that series, it's really not, because you will see some of these characters in the next Blood and Ash book. So they're written in a way that when you finish Born of Blood and Ash, and then when Primal of Blood and Bone, sorry, comes out, it matches the
Okay.
timelines. Like so they intersect basically.
Okay, yeah, okay. I get it now because that's what I did with my one of my series. I wrote three books, and then I thought the same thing. I'm gonna have this huge info dump. It's not gonna make sense. So I went back and did one prequel, and when I give my reading order, I say, okay, read books one, two, three, and then jump back and then read the finale. So
Yeah. Yeah,
fun.
I feel like if you're like me, where it's like, oh, this was such a good idea, until you're like knee deep in it, and you were like, why did anybody let me do this? because now you have two timelines that you have to remember and keep separate. And it is, it was like one of those things where I was like, oh my gosh, what was I getting myself into?
Well, and you're writing them at the same time. That would be hard
Yeah.
too. And there are multiple prequels as well as multiple current timelines, correct?
Yeah, like, well, with the prequel, it basically, we could easily say it's two timelines. Like however, there's so much that goes on in each of them, and then the time that passes, so in a way there are multiple timelines. And again, like with you, it's like you have to kind of remember, like, okay, well, 6 months or a year passed in this book, not that book, kind of thing,
Right.
where switching your head from one series to the next.
Right. And set us up. Well, I'll ask this question first. If you read the prequel first and then read Bone and Blood, sorry, I'm getting them all mixed up, and then read the current series, will it give some spoilers away, or will you still be okay?
Oh no, it would definitely not give any type of spoilers. What it would do is it would, and even if you read Blood and Ash first, you're definitely not getting spoilers, because there's quite a bit of misinformation in there, and misdirection. But what it does, it would help you probably understand certain things better, like why the society is the way it is, how the hierarchy was determined. The only thing that you may have is probably more suspicion towards like certain groups of people, because you would have seen them um, in the prequel. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that makes them bad. But like I think that you would, you may be a little bit more suspicious and maybe less accepting of certain things.
That makes sense. Well, set up the characters in the world for us. So someone coming in, not having read this at all, it looks like you have, well, at least in the prequel books, you have gods warring with each other, perhaps.
Yes. So the main character in that series is Serafina Morel, and she is the first daughter of the queen and king, but she's not treated as a princess or anything like that, because many years before the start of this book, after a great war, the king of her kingdom, many this is hundreds of years and previous to this, had summoned a god to bring and when I say wealth, I don't only mean money, but to bring like bounties back because the war had torn apart the kingdom, and he had summoned a god to step forward and tried to help, the crops to grow again and to repair the land that was damaged due to war. And during that time, when that happened, the god agreed to do it, but asked for the first daughter that was born of the family line to become his consort. This god never explained why, or anything like that. And so a couple hundred years had passed, and before Serafina was born. And basically, when she was born, it became like a countdown clock, because if she wasn't accepted as the consort by a certain age, everything that this god did would start to undo itself. So you have something called the rot that has been slowly, over the years of her growing up, has been infecting parts of the kingdom. And so her job is to pretty much be prepared and for that when she turns of age, for the god to come. And while I feel like when you're reading the first book, you're kind of just buying into it, right? But like it is addressed in the series as it progressed, the fact that you're taking this at one time, like she is older, obviously, when she's of age, but she was groomed her whole entire life to be this. But there's a little bit of a trick there, because she has been told that the only way to stop the rot is that she has to kill the god that made the deal. And so she's trained, obviously, to be like, the perfect quote unquote wife or seductress, but at the same time, she's trained to kill. And you start off with her, and I'm not going to say this is a spoiler because it happens like immediately. She's rejected. The god comes and is like, yeah, I have no interest, sorry. Peace out.
Oh.
And so she's like, well, no one was expecting that. And so she has to deal with what she feels as being a failure because her kingdom is literally dying. And eventually it will spread past her kingdom and affect the entire realm. So at that point, it basically becomes like this story of finding out why this happened. Why did this god ask for this and then reject her when it came? And at that point, like what starts off as being like a really personal quest for her, it starts pulling back the layers and realizing that this is much bigger than her. And the books really focus on pulling back those different layers and learning that what even they were told wasn't true. And you end up at that point meeting some of the other gods and what we always like to call the big bad, like the big villain. But it's has a lot of adventure, a lot of fighting, but at the heart of it, it's a romance that has all these other elements. And so it definitely also has a lot of personal growth. One thing with my characters that I like to do in fantasy, and it to me, because it's like no matter how powerful those characters are, I like to show them, having what I feel like are realistic struggles. Like with Sierra, it's anxiety and, and also depression that stems a lot from how she was raised. And, and it takes her a while to acknowledge that and to face that, or for her to even admit that how she was raised was so wrong. And because all her choice was stripped from her before she was even a figment of a family's imagination. And having her also deal with that.
I can imagine that at some point she's going to get really pissed off about that.
Oh, she does. Yes.
I'm hoping for that. That's what I want. That's the part I would want to read.
Yes, that definitely happens. Probably more than once.
And do they have magic or is it no?
No, so they have a form of what is called like basically I'm always very heavily inspired by Greek mythology.
Okay.
I've always, since I was a child, I was just obsessed with it. So some of these words you may actually, recognize, but like in Greek mythology, ether is like the substance that makes up everything. And I believe like the mountain, if I'm wrong, just ignore me. It's been a while. And it's also hard, like when you use it for your own stuff, that you're like, am I conflating it with the mythology? But I believe like Mount Olympus, I think it says something surrounding the ether. It's something like that. So that's where I kind of got the idea for ether. So ether is like what we call the primal essence. And so these are primordial gods, meaning these are the ones that were there at the beginning. And so there is magic. It's not like standard magic, like where spells or anything like that's done. But it's the ether. It's being able to use like godly powers. There are I know like a lot of the readers, of course, are like I think some of the favorite what you consider magical creatures that are in it are the Draken, which are dragons that so like it's a standard shifters, but these are obviously these were created by the first what is called the true primal life. And they can shift back and forth into what is a dragon form. But I know a lot of the readers really love the dragons when they come out.
Dragons seem to be a favorite of a lot of readers. Yes, I agree.
I feel like I feel like it brings us back to when we were young, like kids, and it's like because I mean dragons, right? Even though in the real world, we all would be like screaming and running for the hills, and it would have none of that.
And so can the humans wield any of this power or summon the power, or is it only granted by the gods then?
It's only the gods can do it. Now there are some of the humans that have more. Basically, the best way for me to describe it is there was a god sitting on that family tree somewhere down the line.
Okay.
And so some of them, have certain abilities that, they don't know that's why. Like, for example, one of them is intuition, like stronger intuition than what I feel like we all have intuition, but we rarely listen to it ever when it happens. But in this case, that intuition is almost magical because it can really tell you or lead you somewhere. Some are better at healing than others, where they think it's the medicine they're making, but in reality, it's their hands, it's that ether. But they aren't necessarily aware of it because it's so many generations down that there was a god that was probably doing something they weren't supposed to be doing.
Like it's ingrained in their heritage or their
Yeah.
DNA almost. Interesting.
Yes.
And you just kind of, maybe I won't say you glossed over it because that was me interpreting, but you said this is mainly a romance series. Do you consider it like a romantasy series? I mean, I know that's like a new hot term right now.
Well, so yes, it's 100% a romance. It's so back in the day, we used to call that romance with a fantasy genre. It's like it's always existed. And while I love that that it has been given a new name, I think it's like romantic. I mean, it's impronounceable. What they call it now, romantophanis. I don't know. Like it's two words people have meshed together, and I mean, I think it's great because it gets attention on it. But fantasy romance on some level has always been there. It's not just it's usually not the fantasy you're seeing right now. I don't know, like if you remember back, I always say back in the day, let's say about 15 years ago or so, one of the biggest genres was what they called urban fantasy. And urban fantasy was fantasy that took place in our world. Like, so some of the, like Nylene Easton is an example, her Guild Hunter series where, they're basically these archangels rule over the human world and everything else is normal, except for you have angels running around. But that was really big. And it was really big for romance. Like most of your urban fantasies were romance or had strong romantic elements. Fantasy, however, really did not like have romance in it. And one of the reasons being that the books that did have it, they were never shelved in the fantasy section. They would be shelved usually in the romance section. But as you know, that when you go into a bookstore and you go to the romance section and you're looking, certain types of readers like to read fantasy. And there are some readers who just don't, like they just don't want to read fantasy. So with it being always in the romance section, it kind of hurt it because they couldn't put it in the fantasy section because it just wasn't a thing. And then I will say, like over the last, like I want to say probably like maybe 2016 or so, you started to see some of the fantasy romances that started off in YA eventually start. What I think everybody realized is a lot of adults were reading these books and kind of looking around and being like, we don't really have anything like this that is adult, like that's 100% adult. And so I think that's when you start to see the door opening on that. But these books are 100% romance. They just aren't just romance. Not that there's anything wrong with just romance. I've written them, many of them, but they have all these other elements. And like I said, you would back like 10 years ago, you would just say it's romance with a subgenre of fantasy. But now it has a cool term, a cool phrase to call it.
So that's intriguing to me. So when you sit down and think about a plot of a book, do you sit down and think, so you like in this series, your main character is Serafina. Do you think, okay, who is she going to end up with in the end and how do I get her there? Is that what you're you're thinking about, and then all the fantasy is subplots?
Well, yeah. So like I feel like I kind of think no matter what genre I'm writing, I feel like I almost approach it, I want to say 90% the same. Usually what comes to me, and now see, I'm going to completely contradict myself here in 5 seconds with this, but what usually comes to me is the character, right? Is the main character first. And then I know like, and I feel like at the same time the character comes to me, so does the genre. Like I know I'm dealing with a contemporary. I know I'm dealing with paranormal or a thriller. Um, the fantasies were different because I had always wanted to read, always wanted to write a fantasy, but I was very intimidated because I had never written a high fantasy before. So, and because I think some things that we don't sometimes realize is that with any book that takes place in our world, we don't have to worry about building that for readers, right? You say a skyscraper, people know what you're talking about. But when you're dealing with something like a high fantasy, you have to build this entire world and it has to make sense. And then you have to remember what you said about this world so that it makes sense. And I found that very intimidating, but I actually came up with the idea for the world before I came up with the characters, which is very odd for me. But I came up with the idea in like 2016, and it took me a good 3 years before I felt that, okay, I'm going to actually try to do this. So I had 3 years where in between books, I was kind of like tinkering with the world. So it allowed me to build the world before I even allowed myself to think of more than just one character. Because I want to say because I started this with Blood and Ash, or from Blood and Ash. Poppy came to me very quickly when I came up with the idea, but I gave myself like so much time to build that world because it's like having performance anxiety. I was like, can I really do this? This isn't like writing, something that takes place in our world where, yeah, there may be magical beings running around, but I'm not having to explain all this stuff. And I'm also not having to spend an ungodly amount of time doing research on what type of buildings would have made sense for you to have if you didn't, like, you just fall down these ridiculous rabbit holes. I feel like when you're writing fantasy where you have to learn certain things, and it's just 3 hours go by and you're like, I'm pretty sure I can dress someone in either medieval or Regency era clothing perfectly. You
Yeah.
have to read about it.
Yeah, I totally know those rabbit holes. That's really, yeah, but it seems like you were taking that time. Maybe you were able to make the world really rich and develop all these plots and intricacies where you were able to create this prequel series that led into your main series.
Yeah, I think that's what helped me like be able to do the prequel like pretty quickly, because spending all that time um really tinkering and thinking about the world. And because what my original idea, like obviously there are some aspects of it that is the same, but the plot would have been totally different. And so it just, because I was kind of thinking, oh, this doesn't work, this does this. And so I had all this time to really, get in the world before I was actually writing it, which was such a different experience for me. Because like when I normally write, I don't do that. I don't know how you normally write yours. I don't know if you do that. Like we spend more time before you start writing with buildings, the realm, the world, or the characters.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I came into fantasy as an urban fantasy writer too, YA urban fantasy, and that felt easier to me.
Yeah.
And then from that series, I did a crossover series, and it's still contemporary, but it's not urban because it's a world beneath our world. So, but it's
Yeah.
urban. Anyway, so
Also,
yeah.
also, what do they call urban fantasy now? Because it's not called that anymore.
Well, in
Yeah.
urban fantasies to me, when somebody presents an urban fantasy to me now, it seems more like it'd be a crime series
Mhm.
with paranormal characters almost.
Yeah. Yeah, so what I just call it now, I'm like, it's contemporary fantasy. That's the only thing I can think of because I'm like, I know they don't call it that anymore. And I never understood why they called it that. It's like it's just such a weird term, but yeah, I feel like yes, I agree with you. Like I hate saying like when I write the paranormal or the contemporary stuff that it's easier to write, but it is for me because I'm not having again to create these worlds, because there's just so much that in writing you don't realize that you gloss over when you're writing in our world. And then once you're in a world that doesn't exist, it's like you have to set that framework for everything.
And how do you keep up with everything? Because I talked to one author who's like, she had an Excel spreadsheet with literally every scene, and that went to her editor, and the editor double checked everything. And so for every book of every scene and her whole series, that she had this like Excel document, and I was like blown away. I was like, okay, I am lucky if
Yeah.
I write, a table of contents or a outline after I finish the book. So
Yeah, that's me. I am envious of someone who has the time and the patience to do that. So I got lucky. So one of the editors at the publisher, um, like in some of my other books, like if it was a couple like books into a series, they would create like I wouldn't call them Bibles, but like chapter by chapter breakdowns, which I thought when they would send edits back was so helpful because I'm like, I don't even remember what I wrote in that chapter. Like, what do you mean chapter 15 has to be like, what is that even about? But like, so what they started doing, and I think it was the copy editor who started it. Because a lot of times the copy editors do have they create their own manuals of series, like, oh, you said this about this then, so they can double check it. Well, that grew and grew until it became a Bible. I mean, so the editing team, like they end up having to create for themselves like these it is the amount I printed one of them off once for um A Shadow in the Ember, which is the first book in the Flesh and Fire series. I printed it out and it was like I was like, okay, never again am I printing this out. Like it was just so because like each character has its own little file of everything about them. Then there's a folder for timelines, there's a folder for bloodlines, there's a folder for like the maps, like of the kingdoms or the different places. There's a folder for the culture, the history. It's so much information. And now, I mean, I am so, and I mean, I every time I see them, I just want to hug and kiss them because I think a lot of times readers think that we remember everything. I mean, me, no, 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 no. Like, so I remember some things, but like sometimes things just go, you write it and it goes right out your other head. And, you see it again when you're doing edits and stuff, but then you forget it again. And so there's been times that I've had to go back to the Bible and look to be like, hey, wait a minute, what did I say about this? And I have to go back and just double check it. Because also I do feel like you do, sometimes you're like, what you wrote, but then you're like double guessing yourself and being like, wait a minute, let me make sure. And so, yeah, I rely on that Bible because I feel like when you write fantasy, I mean, at least for me, there's no way I could remember. I mean, because this world in reality is a total already of 10 books, even though, again, one is a different series. Remembering all that stuff that I no longer have the brain power for that.
And in the okay, so tell me again what not the prequel series, but what I'll call it contemporary series because it's happening now. What is the name of that one? Tell me again.
So that is the Blood and Ash series, and
Blood
the
and
first book in that is called From Blood and Ash.
Okay, and you're in the third or fourth book of that series.
Um, that is no, that is 5 of those books are out, and then
Okay.
the 6th book comes out next year.
Okay.
And the
Well,
6th book is it's kind of the last book. I mean, there
okay.
are other books that will come in the world, but it won't be the same characters or the same plots. Like, the arcs, basically the overall reaching arc will be completed at that point.
Fun.
But they're both high fantasy. So even with Blood and Ash, it's not going to be in our modern world. It's a very like a mix between like medieval and Regency era. Like there's some things I think that have a very medieval vibe, and then other things that have a little bit more advanced feel to it.
Well, I think high fantasy, and especially it sounds like with the culture and community that you've created, at least it doesn't seem like you would butt heads with anything anybody else did. Like, so like if you were gonna write fae, you would have to be careful not to, I mean, you could make them a little different, but if you strayed too far, people would say, no, this is not fae, you know? So yeah.
Well, I think though, I do think like I forget the saying. Like there was somebody many years ago, like I feel like in the time of Shakespeare or before that, had said that there's only 7 ways to tell a story, right? Or some kind of saying like that. There's only 7 original stories in the world. And every story derives from one of these 7 stories. And so I do think whenever you're dealing with any genre, and this is for any genre, no matter like what somebody writes, there are certain tropes that genre has that readers look for, right? If you're reading a thriller, right? You're looking for a suspense. You're looking for something that kind of messes with your head. If you're looking for a horror, you're looking for something that's going to scare you. And in each of those genres, I feel like you see things you're going to recognize, like because they're going to employ certain tropes. So, but the whole thing is, I feel like it's what you do with those tropes. Like with fantasy, I feel like we all know there's going to be a certain things that are going to happen. There's always a bad kingdom or a bad, or like the royalty died and now there's a fight for the throne, or there's a hidden prince or princess. And I feel like no matter what, if it's just mortals or it's fae or shifters or vampires or um, any of that, it still almost has those certain tropes that builds the framework, but they don't read the same. And that's because it's like what you do with those characters and that plot is why I mean, at least you hope that
Right, definitely.
oh yeah, like but like yeah. So I mean, I feel like it's like you have to always, it's like you have to retell. But I will say certain things like Faye would be difficult because like there's been a lot of Faye right in the years, and then there's really popular books that have that, and so it's like it's like what would you do to make that different? And I do think that can be difficult. Like that would be another thing for me, but I have to spend another 3 years trying to figure that out.
Well, yeah, I totally agree with that. And I did write Fae, but I didn't read any Fae to start with. So that was my mistake. But now I'm like, my Fae are really different. Because I didn't read anything beforehand. So
yeah, and I think that sometimes it's better. Like some people will tell you, no, you need to read that, right? And then other people will be like, no, because it's gonna unintentionally put things in your head that what I mean, like because when you're writing, you're inspired by everything. You know how like when readers ask or someone asks like what inspired you, and that's always been so hard for me to answer because sometimes I can't tell you. It was multiple different things, and sometimes it's really weird shit, like a commercial I've had it inspired me for something. For the Blood and Ash series, it was the 2016 Olympics, and these books have absolutely nothing to do with the Olympics. And so it's like I can't explain that. And so I'm the same way though. Whatever I'm writing, I cannot read.
Oh yeah, definitely.
During that times. Yeah. So if I'm writing fantasy, I have to read like contemporary or something like that. Like because I just don't, because for me it also feels like I'm working because I will start comparing what I'm writing to what I'm reading. And I feel like you also don't want to be unintentionally influenced or take on the voice of what you're reading. Like where you almost start mimicking what you're reading in your writing. And so I always try to read something vastly different when I'm writing a genre.
That's exactly what I do. Yeah, I'm on my sweet romance kick because I'm writing my fantasy right now. So yeah. So how did you get your start? What was your first book? What led you to be an author?
So as cliche as it sounds, I always wanted to be an author. I grew up very, very, very poor. So during summers, like we didn't go on summer vacations. What we had, my mom would walk my brother and I to the town library. So reading was kind of like the vacation. It was escapism. That was purely what it was. And so I really at a young age got into a lot of reading. And I feel like if I remember correctly, we would go to the library, I think every Friday. And I don't know if I'm sure they still do this, but like when you donate books to a library, they usually cannot put them out on their shelves to be loaned. They usually they'll give them away for free. Or if they're doing like a charity sale, they'll sell them. And so there were these racks of books that you were allowed to keep, and they were always historical romance novels. And so this was in the 90s so that means that these were historical romances from the 80s and 90s. They are not what you read today, and I remember reading them at 12 and 13 and then just being really educated on stuff. Yes, and she's like, oh dear. But that started really my love of reading. But I remember reading like my first actual young adult book, and this was The Vampire Diaries. And so a lot of people don't realize that was a young adult series from the 90s. And I remember it was LJ Smith, and I remember crying and just being like, why am I know this isn't real. Like, why am I upset? And that really, at that point, I was like, man, I would love to be able to write and not to make people cry. It's to be able to evoke that type of emotion. So I had written my first book when I was in ninth grade during algebra class. Do not recommend. I ended up having to take remedial math in college because of that. Because I didn't pay attention at all. Don't even know how I passed the class. But I also knew that becoming a writer and that being something that I could do full time, if that's what I wanted, was felt like a shot in the dark, right? So I went to school for, and this is nothing like writing. I went to school for psychology and sociology with a criminology focus, which, I like to tell myself that all that I learned in psychology helps me build a more real character.
I was gonna say,
At least when I paid off my student loans, that's what I told myself. But I do always tell us, people who are starting off, like, you don't have to go to college for writing. You can if the technical side is your passion. But I'm always like, find your second passion, because you have to have something to fall back on, or like or something that helps you there. But I didn't start seriously writing again until 2007. And then when I wrote my first book, Half Blood, um, and that was a young adult novel. It took me, I want to say it was like 2 years, I think, before I got up the courage to go on submission, because back in like that era, self-publishing, for example, wasn't a viable option. There was pretty much two people, Hugh Howey, I think, and Amanda. Oh my God, her name was on my freaking tip of my tongue. But like there were basically two authors that you could think of that were able to self-publish, and also independent publishers. Small publishers were not a thing. So at that time, especially in young adult, it wasn't, because your books have to be in the bookstore, because teenagers don't typically have credit cards and things like that to go buy this stuff. But like when I went on submission, you have to go to an agent first. I was, getting a lot of like requests for partials, or, then you don't hear nothing back for forever. And then I saw this piece of advice. Someone said that when you're sending your first book out in submission, you should be writing your second book that's unrelated to the first book, because if that doesn't sell, you have something else. So after I finished my second book, I thought, you know what, I'm going to try like one of these small presses, because in around 2009, 2010, small presses were also a new thing for doing commercial fiction. Like most of your coffee books, your certain things like that come from small independent publishers, but usually at that time, not what they call commercial fiction. And so my first book deal was with a small press. And after that, I did get an agent who had rejected me first, beforehand on a different book. And then I submitted another book to her. And I like to remind her often that she had actually rejected me first. But so I went like a very non-traditional route, like my first couple books, because when if you deal with traditional publishing, especially then, is like the book that I sold it was to Disney Hyperion in 2011. I don't think that thing came out until 2015
Oh,
or
wow.
14. It was ridiculous. Like how long it took. But I ended up getting another publishing contract in YA with Harlequin Teen. And I do think that came out before the Disney book did. But also I was working with a small publisher at the same time. And those books were coming out 3 months apart. And so even though my publishing journey, the start of it was really non-traditional, I was able to build up a readership pretty quickly and a backlist pretty quickly because, small publishers or medium-sized ones now, because many of them are larger publishers now or medium-sized publishers now, they could publish things quicker and they could react more quickly to certain things. So also during that time, bloggers were the big thing. So it was like, and TikTok, Book Talk did not exist. It was book bloggers. And I just got like really, really lucky with getting the support of some of the book bloggers. Like they just had picked up the book. Because keep in mind again, back then, small press and indie books were not heavily supported. That you could not find them in a bookstore. Barnes and Noble was like, LOL, no. Like this was not a thing. And keep in mind, that isn't even until recently that Barnes and Noble started putting small press books and indie books into their bookstore. And that really was thanks to Waterstones taking over and kind of changing how they buy their books. But it was a very unorthodox way of starting. And I remember, I think I received, and I still have them in my email. I refuse to delete them. I think it was 169 rejections before I got my agent. And, and so that, that just shows you like sometimes, because I think we hear about like the best stories, right? The person who wrote one story and got multiple agents interested and then it went to auction. But that's not how it is for the overwhelming majority of writers. You spend a lot of time in the slush pile.
Yeah, I was going to say, I haven't talked to any authors who had multiple offers. I've talked to most who have that 150 rejections. So.
Yeah. And the thing is, they're out there, but they are the rarity. They are the rarity. And usually, and it's not because somebody was better than somebody else. It's usually, as I always believe, it's timing. Somebody wrote something that somebody or some people were looking for at that time. And, and a lot of it, and I think sometimes that's hard to swallow, that there's such an uncontrollable factor, no matter what phase of your career you're in, that you can't control. It's like the special sauce in the Big Mac, like just, or the moon phases have to be, correctly lined up for you. But I'm glad I started the way I did because it allowed me to, have control even with the publishers, because I knew how certain things were done. And so it allowed me, I feel like, to have a voice when I was dealing with the publishers because I knew how publishing worked at this point. And I feel like that's another advice I give authors, like learn how books are published, learn what they do, because you will then understand certain things better, but also start to notice when maybe things aren't being handled in the best way.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's a really interesting journey. It's interesting to me that you have so many different publishers with all your series and books. You mentioned that most of your books are very character-based. Do you have general, I mean, I know you have a lot of books and a lot of series, so, but do you have general themes that are your favorite that you feel like you gravitate towards?
I feel like like I like to have themes that in most of my books, there are themes that you don't really realize it that is there underneath everything. And because I often feel like whenever we're trying to make a statement or to show people about certain disorders or anything like that, that when you're shoving it down, people feel like you're shoving it down their throat. Also, as being a big romance reader, for the longest time, one of the things I noticed is that you never had romances where the character had a mental health struggle. And if they did have a mental health struggle, that then translated into the relationship and the sex almost being a consequence of the mental health struggle, where they engaged in risky behaviors and things like that. But if you really think back about any book that you read that people had mental health struggles, like anxiety, depression, something that the vast majority of people in the world today have or have struggled with, there is no happy ending there. There's no, for the longest time, there was no romance there because that was the sum of who that person was. And as somebody who comes from a field of psychology, that just would irk me because I'm like, they're just like you. Like, we're just like you, right? You just have this one thing that maybe flares up from time to time. So you'll notice in a lot of my books, like fantasies, paranormal, contemporary, there are often like struggles there. Like this series, Flesh and Fire, Sierra has anxiety and depression that she deals with. And then, in some of my contemporary books, like I have a character who doesn't realize that she was self-medicating with alcohol, but at the same time, these were romances. Like, because what I used to always think when I would read romance, and young adult was the same way, was, oh, so if I have depression, then I can't expect to have the love of my life. I can't expect to have this adventure. I can't expect to be able to become someone powerful one day. And so you'll notice in a lot of my books, the characters will have certain things like that because, again, it's not the sum of who that person is. It's just a part of them. And I wanted to put that in the book. So I do have those types of things, but it's not done in like an after school special type of way, like where it's just a part of the story.
Yeah, I like that theme of, being the whole person and just looking at one part of their life doesn't predict what the rest of
Yeah.
their life is going to end up with or their potential in whatever area you're looking at, whether it's falling in love or whether it's
Yeah.
attaining a degree or anything like
Yeah, and
that.
I think that we definitely are seeing more of that now. I think as like, because you really, when you think about like in society, the stigma of like mental health has only just begun, probably in the last couple years, to really start to kind of lift enough that where you have people who you would never guess coming forward and saying, I struggle with this. I go to therapy. I have to take medication. I have, and it's, you're starting to realize now where it's not something to be ashamed of, like, or hidden, like it has been for so long. So I do think you definitely are seeing way more books now with that in there. But yeah, it was just one of the things I always noticed, especially coming from the field of psychology, where it was like, this is not being represented at all. And especially when you look at the statistics of how many people, it's like the vast majority of people have had experience with this, and it's just not there. It's just nobody has a panic attack in this world. You know what I mean? Like, and especially I always think like when you're dealing with fantasies and paranormal, I'm like, my God, I'd be over here rocking in the corner. Like I'd be like, nope. like, it's like you would have problems dealing with this.
There's a person shifting to a wolf in front of you. I think you're
Right?
getting
Like
freaked
I'm
out.
thinking, am I hallucinating?
Yeah.
Like what just happened here? But also
I-
you think about what these characters experience in this world. I mean, like you can just think of, let's say, something that a lot of people have read or watched, like Game of Thrones or House of Dragon. that is some messed up stuff. Like you're not going to be okay. I'm sorry. And if you are, you're a sociopath. Like you're not going to process this really well. And I feel like that's like, I feel like it makes it more realistic because I know when I'm reading or watching some of this stuff, I'm like, oh yeah, I would just call it quits at this point. Like there's just no way I recover from seeing my father get beheaded, for example. Like there's things that I feel like it just makes these characters more real because they react, I feel like, how we would react in that world. Where eventually you have to pick yourself back up. You got to put yourself back together. And but like I feel like sometimes when we see these things, it's like everyone's just like, oh shucks, that sucked. I gotta move on. And you're just like, nope.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes I think about it like medieval settings or Middle Ages settings, and life was, or even before that time, like life was so much harder. Like you were fighting for like your survival left and right, day and night, and getting food and all shelter and staying away from the cold. And maybe seeing more death and tragedy and sickness.
Oh yeah.
I always go back and wonder if it felt different to them because it was just more normal. Not
I
that it
think
would be as sad, but I always wonder
yeah,
like if they
you
were
get
hardier
this.
folk than we are.
Well, I think what it is like, so like as we all know, like let's say back in the medieval times, because that was just a sucktastic time of history all around for everybody. Um, People had mental health concerns back there. I mean, back then, people had schizophrenia, people had you know, bipolar, depression, whatever. But the one thing that people didn't have was the luxury, and I hate to say luxury, but in context to that time, right, that era, you couldn't afford to take time off to deal with that, right? Like you to survive, you had to pick yourself back up. Um, and you had to keep going. But I do think what happened is people got desensitized to death and loss and disease because you saw it since birth. Like, you know, especially if you grew up during any of the plagues that were, you know, coming back around every so many decades. I mean, it's I imagine for them is they got desensitized to it where it's and especially if you were considered like a commoner, a poor you were poor, you know, you had no choice but to kind of like shake yourself off. But I think the difference is it's like when you're reading a book and you're in like the head of a character, it's like I'm always like I want to see an acknowledgement of what you just saw. Like acknowledge like, you know, oh, you know, the effect that it has on you. Because I think that, you know, you can have trouble dealing with something like that at the same time you're picking yourself up, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's like us in real world. You're still going to work. You may not be handling something well, but you're still getting up and you're still going to work, and people don't realize that you may be struggling with something. Um, but yeah, in the Middle Ages, man, that was not a time to be alive.
No, it was not. Well, this has been so great having you here. I love to end with this final question. Hopefully it won't be too much of a stumper. And you can pick one book if you want, or you can pick like overall theme. But if somebody picks up your book, what's the thing you love for them to get out of your book or experience from reading one of your books?
Honestly, I think for any of my books, what I would want for them to get is an escape. I want them to be able to read any of my books and forget about everything that's happening in their life. Because as a teenager, I felt like that is what kept my head above and kept me floating is the escapism. And that's what I want from any of my books is that it allows people to take a break and not have to think about things going on in their own life or going on in the world at that moment just for a little bit. And, you know, any of my books, that's all I hope people pick it up.
That sounds like so much fun. I'm all about escapism. So I will be picking up your romances soon. Well, thank you, Jennifer, so much for being here. Tell us
Thank
where
you.
we can find you in your books.
You can head over to my website. It's jenniferlarmentrout.com. From there, you can sign up for the newsletter, and you can also join the reader group, which is where I'm mostly seen at online.
Fun. Well, yes, I'm sure people will want to be there. And thank you again. And I hope that you'll come back when your next book releases.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Have a good night. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Finding the Magic podcast. I'm your host, author and podcaster Tricia Copeland, and I love getting behind the scenes. If you like the podcast, make sure to subscribe and stop in each week to discover new authors and books. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep finding the magic.